The night the CEO laughed, the city leaned in closer. Rain stitched silver lines down the glass of the rooftop bar where power gathered. He stood at the center, a man in a sharp suit, his grin practiced and sharp. Tonight his amusement landed on someone with no place at that table, a man who slept on benches and kept his life in a paper bag. He's not even fit to fly a chopper, the CEO sneered, and the table followed his ease of cruelty. Then he tossed the line with careless bravado. In fact, I'll make you a deal. Fly this chopper, and I'll marry you. They laughed. The woman at his side did not. She had defended the man once, sliding him a sandwich when no one was looking. Her laughter stayed in her throat. Outside, under a dripping awning, the man met her eyes without begging. Something in him was steady, like an old radio station that hadn't lost its signal. The next morning the joke became a blip in the business feed. The woman found him by a donut shop, wrapped in an old blanket and watching the street with a face that had seen too much. She sat across from him. "Do you know how to fly a helicopter?" she asked. He nodded. "I used to. Air Force, medevac later. Flew people out when they needed to get home." "Why are you out here?" she asked. He shrugged and looked toward the highway. "I asked for help." The world kept moving. Sometimes people fall between the cracks. She offered no speech. She offered a plan. "There's a chopper at the company heliport," she said. "He wants a show. He wants to humiliate you. Prove him wrong. If you fly it, I'll make sure you get help." They moved fast. Security blinked at the two of them walking into a space reserved for suits, but her badge and a tone of authority opened doors. The helicopter sat like a polished beast, chrome catching wash of the city's light. Marcus stepped into the cockpit like a man coming home. He ran his hands over the controls with the ease of memory. When the CEO saw him, amusement sharpened into curiosity. He didn't believe the man could do it. "Fine," he said. "Prove it. Fly the chopper." They lifted. The city fell away and the man became something different in the air. He spoke without ego, guiding the woman through neighborhoods, naming places where he'd landed to save lives, telling stories of rushed sirens and held hands. For the first time in months, the woman watched someone at work who had purpose stitched into his movements. They returned to applause that surprised them all. Phones had captured a flight that dissolved a rumor into a record. The CEO's smirk found a crack. "Who are you?" he asked. "Marcus Reed," the man said. "I flew medevacs. Lost things. Made choices I'm not proud of. But I remember how to bring people home." A nurse from years past recognized him. An old clipping surfaced on a phone. Memories came in like a rising tide. The company wanted to wrap the moment into a PR patch, but Marcus didn't want a soundbite. He wanted work that mattered and a chance to be steady. The woman refused charity and pushed for something durable. She proposed a paid pilot role in the company's community outreach, someone to run medevac and outreach missions to neighborhoods with fragile access to care. She argued with numbers and stubborn compassion. It wasn't instant. Paperwork and old prejudices had teeth. But Marcus passed the checks. He earned the job through competence and quiet determination. The city gave him a modest apartment, a few belongings, a worn flight map, and a watch that had kept his father's time. He and the woman grew close in a way that did not make headlines. Coffee turned into company. He taught her to read the wind. She taught him to trust forms and schedules. They argued and forgave and learned the contours of each other's fears. Their lives interlaced not as rescue, but as partnership. He hadn't always been on the pavement. Marcus grew up near runways and joined the Air Force with a hunger like purpose. He learned to read instruments the way others read faces. He flew medevacs and brought people into surgery, once racing through a storm to get a child to an operating room. Those years left marks of pride and sorrow. After loss and bad choices, and a night that fractured him, he drank to drown memories. Benefits shifted, systems failed, and a pilot's log that had been his identity ended up under a bench. He learned the city's cracks and how lights hide disasters. There were nights he woke on concrete, and mornings he learned to tie his life together again in small pieces. The woman had a different loneliness. She fixed problems with plans and believed competence could be a shield. Giving him a sandwich was a small thing, but it opened a quiet exchange that neither expected. She saw steadiness in him that wasn't visible in a meme. In the air, the city became a map of needs. Marcus pointed out a clinic without a helipad and a shelter that could use supplies. He told a story about a baby who had stopped breathing and the way the hospital staff had held on until the chopper arrived. His voice was steady and small, the sort of voice earned by people who once watched life slip like water and decided to pull it back. The flurry afterward felt like a tidal wave. The company drafted PR posts and tried to make amends with stage gestures. Marcus watched the stunt-like apologies with a suspicion born of being made spectacle too many times. He didn't want a plaque with his name or a staged interview. He wanted work that would let him be useful again and quiet nights where he could remember his wife and not be buried in a tide of shame. The woman, most dangerously for corporate culture, wanted to do the right thing in a way that would stick. She fought meetings that called for shallow gestures. She drafted a program that married community need to corporate capacity, a medevac outreach that could reach underserved neighborhoods, a training wing for volunteer pilots, and a small fund for immediate emergency supplies. She argued that hiring someone with Marcus's experience would be a force multiplier and a moral obligation. Marcus's re-entry into formal life required paperwork, physicals, and a bureaucratic patience he had not practiced in years. He trained on simulators and remembered how to translate instinct into checklists. He met with doctors who helped him untangle the threads that tied him to bottles. Friends from the streets showed up when he got his first small apartment, cheering like it was a victory parade. The company's culture shifted in small ways. Training budgets were adjusted. Policies for rehiring people who had fallen on hard times were explored. People who had laughed found themselves apologizing in more earnest tones. The CEO had a private moment where he watched Marcus train a group of new pilots and felt the first prick of shame at his own earlier cruelty. It didn't make him a saint overnight, but laughter softened into curiosity, and curiosity turned to a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. There were quiet nights when Marcus listed small mercies like coordinates, a clean shirt, a coffee, a call returned. The woman sat with him through forms and taught him to speak on conference calls without the old tremor. She helped him translate instinct into checklists and welcomed the vulnerability that followed. The training wing became their shared mission. Marcus built a curriculum that married piloting skills to community care. He taught crews to ask before delivering aid, to treat neighborhoods as partners instead of projects, and to leave dignity in their wake. Volunteers came, retirees who flew on weekends, and nurses who wanted to be part of rapid response teams. The manuals grew footnotes about the people he had met on sidewalks and in ER corridors. Not every day was smooth. A late call once sent them into a storm to reach a mother in labor and a child needing urgent care. Instruments flickered and the flight felt thin against the wind. They landed in a muddy field and worked with hands that remembered muscle memory and faith. Afterwards, they were wet and exhausted. The woman held Marcus without words, and the crew knew they'd done what mattered. The CEO watched these scenes and felt his laughter shrink. He came to training sessions and listened. He began to ask different questions and started a modest scholarship for pilots who had fallen on hard times. It was a small attempt to fix a big oversight, and it mattered. On walks through neighborhoods Marcus once flew over, they were greeted by people who remembered the man who had once landed at a clinic with a child and a borrowed hope. The city, once anonymous and sharp, softened into neighborhoods that knew their names. Small acts had rerouted a life. Their wedding was small and local, a hospital garden where volunteers and nurses who had worked with Marcus gathered. Old friends came in worn shoes, clapping as if it was the end of a long game. The CEO came, awkward and quieter, and he brought with him a donation to the outreach fund, his apology folded into action. They left the garden in a helicopter. Marcus piloted them not because he wanted to prove anything to anyone, but because he loved the simple, steady work of flying. He guided them to an old airfield where a plaque honored pilots who had served and those who had been found again. It was not a fairy tale fixed by a single stunt. It was a story of choices, a woman who refused to laugh, a man who still remembered how to fly, and a city that learned to measure people by more than their clothes. As the sun dipped, Marcus put his hand on the controls and felt something like peace settle in. He looked at the woman and said, "Thank you for finding me." She smiled and answered, "Thank you for coming home."